We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Take your own advice.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No delusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Harry, find your head, your president.
Welcome to the AnteDote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothkushel.
All right. It is Wednesday, January 31st, and we are coming back for last day of the month here. And Jeremy, we've been there's some, I think, looks to be some pretty significant diplomatic moves being made with relation to that have been looks like from the United Kingdom proposed in a very serious way. As we were just playing a clip indicating this of what appears to be some serious moves being made in terms of relating to Israel-Palestine, and in a direction that I don't know if you know it was really seen as coming, but then also something that certainly been talked about for a long time. And we want to let's take some time to get into this with this talk of serious talk coming out about formation of a Palestinian state, with being spearheaded. Looks like UK kind of taking the lead on this with the looks like there's cooperation with elements within the Biden administration.
Yes, and I think the timing of this is very interesting and instructive, because it looks like obviously there's elements of the Biden administration that understand that though they thought they may have been making a smart diplomatic choice immediately after October 7th for this infamous Joe Biden bear hug, where it included a sort of a fatherly, protective kind of rhetoric toward the Israeli public. And remember, that resonated intensely, where much of aspects of the traumatized part of the Israeli public really saw Biden in that moment as their real president in a certain way. And that was especially as Netanyahu was so obviously, I think, betraying that he was actually implicated in the October 7th Simchat Torah terror treason plot, as he was smirking after his first announcement about how he had activated all the war powers of the Israeli state for the first time in 50 years, since the Yom Kippur War. And he was vampirically utilizing the hostages and the hostage families as they begin to escalate the rhetoric about how, and Netanyahu was doing this via proxies, but how ultimately the hostages and the Israeli hostage families were to be seen as potential sacrifices to the interest and security of the state, right? And so a lot of this was already beginning to go on inside of Israel, with massive distrust, especially from many of the victims' family members and hostage family members. And remember, this is another piece of the politics of this, that these areas that were hit most intensely on October 7th, both by Hamas and by the mass Hannibal directive order of the Israeli military, where they come in and shoot up cars and shoot up, many actually Israeli eventual victims who are trying to escape. Right in the middle of all of that, it must be looked at that there were a lot of potential political opponents to Netanyahu and his terrorist regime. Most obviously, Ben Gvir and Smotrich. These guys are just terrorists, even recognized within Shin Bet in many ways, that these guys are aligned with terrorism. And by the way, Ben Gvir's party, what's it called? Jewish Power, the Jewish Power Party, right? And so that is another piece of suspicion around the nature of the target of this attack, including then the questions of the supernova rave and the apparent non-knowledge of Hamas militants of the rave, but the evidence that the rave organizers had their phones compromised and handed them in to Israeli security services, maybe weeks, maybe a few weeks before the rave, and then the rave was changed location at the very last moment. And all of this in the milieu of both being the historical, ethnically cleansed homelands that the entire idea of right to return, which is really core to the entire question of the resolution of the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict. Right? This is even coming down to this question of UNRWA, right? How immediately after the International, Court of Justice taking on the case, basically what they did was they did not throw out the case about the question of Israel's genocide in Gaza. They basically say there is enough evidence of this, both in terms of stated intent by Israeli officials and the facts on the ground, in terms of the in part or in whole definition of genocide of a people, that the case was seen to be plausible. And so they warned Israel to follow certain rules, which included not targeting groups, members of the group of the potentially genocided people, including the Palestinians. And so then the immediate wake of that, you have this very suspicious, quote unquote, intelligence released. I think it came out in the Wall Street Journal, I believe, maybe the Washington Post. I think the Wall Street Journal, by an obvious, the woman who wrote the article, which was based on interrogation intelligence, right? Do you remember the whole debate about the torture in the United States post 9/11 and the 9/11 confessions and all of that? And torture obviously does not, once you're dealing with like into interrogation that reaches torture levels, none of that is legally applicable evidence of anything, right? And so this article that came out immediately after the ICJ decision to begin to hear the case of the alleged Israeli genocide in Gaza, that is really it's a de facto stated intent over basically since the origins of the Israeli state, that there is from Jabotinsky to then Ben-Gurion, who turns more towards Jabotinsky after he gained state power, that they were going to have to deal with the quote-unquote Arabs who were not going to allow them to just take their land without resisting and fighting back. So they were going to have to confront them, right? And so this was part of a long-term intent that is part and parcel of the entirety of what really became of the political Zionist project of purification, a racial purification of the land of these nasty Arabs who want to call themselves Palestinians, right? And so this originating, UNRWA, this was formed immediately after the originating, the war of independence and the foundation of the Israeli state, and the fact that directly tens of thousands were under direct terrorism. Palestinians were driven from their homes in what became then 1948 Israel, and then most of them ended up in Gaza. And that's who's still there. Some of them are still around, the Palestinians who lost their home. And this is a key thing, remember, of the organic roots of the Palestinian solidarity and equal rights movement is the key. That people keep the keys in their family of their home. And it is a symbol of, this is our This is our legacy, and continues to be our birthright, unfulfilled at this point, to return to our families' homelands. And those keys are passed intergenerationally in many Palestinian families. And so UNRWA was originally founded directly because of the question of refugees, right? And so this is the duplicity of the Israeli state. They will pretend as if Hamas is leading a government, a state government at some point, when they want to declare war and then say that they're following the rules of war. And then they will dismiss the entirety of all these people as just refugees who are just sort of like visiting Gaza until they can find their way or have their way found either into uh, mass burial pits, obviously, as they're doing now to tens of thousands of Palestinians, or to drive them into the Sinai or into the diaspora or into other countries in the region.
And UNRWA was one of the Trump administration's big targets via Nikki Haley as UN ambassador and Pompeo's State Department, and the funding for UNRWA was cut, which was big, and that was, of course, that couple of things there. It serves to undermine a form of opposition or potential challenge standing in the way of certain policies taking place, and then also undermining the American quote unquote leadership in terms of like being involving with the funding of and the activities being carried out there. So now this narrative's in place, and I haven't looked real closely at the news stories about it, but now it comes out that look the UNRWA's they're aiding the terrorists. See, we were right to do this, and we need to just, So it was a major target of the Trump administration, as we know, like really moved in this like very, very hardline friendly policy in terms of like just the enabling of the excesses of settlement policy and all this in ways that other administrations hadn't in the past. So
very important point. That's true. That was one of the first moves that the Trump regime made when they came into power, was to begin to defund UNRWA, right? And so two things I just wanted to close the loop on. I said that, at least tens of thousands of Palestinians were directly via terrorism driven from their homes. Now, more than probably 700,000 Palestinians were also driven from their homes under the cloak of war. Under basically, some of it was I think direct Zionist disinformation. Others of just like, okay, there's a war going on. We need to, we're in the battle space here, and we need to go. But the direct implication was that they were going to be able to come back to their homes once this battle was resolved. Right. So now we are here, almost 80 years later, right? 3/4 of a century later, and they're still quote unquote refugees in Gaza. And so an organization that was created at the same time as their refugee status, that was there to facilitate some of the aid and needs of these refugees, is now finally being targeted intensely for defunding under what looks like a very likely either a disinformation article or gray propaganda, where people are pointing out that even if it's the case that that a handful of UNRWA employees participated in October 7th, that doesn't, that's like, there's, many employees. That doesn't mean that you then defund the entire organization. Like if people would point out that if Netanyahu were found to be at the core of the September 11th attacks, as I believe that he is, would that then say that you then, defund every sort of like human aids package to like Israeli citizens or something like that? No, obviously not. And the other thing is implicated in terms of what you pointed out about the big moves during the Trump years to try to attack UNRWA is it reminds me of what the woman who asked the question while we were getting basically pushed out of the Kansas City Public Library public event with Dennis Ross. Her name is Karen Pack, and she had worked for the Jewish Agency for Israel. She was a key mover and shaker, both with the Jewish Federation, the Jewish Community Foundation, and the Truman Library Institute. And in fact, just this last summer, in the anniversary of the 75th, and the 75th anniversary of the founding of Israel, the Truman Library Institute invited the Herzog family to come talk, and the head of the Truman Library Institute, I believe, actually acknowledged that Karen Pack was this crucial connector via the Jewish Agency to get the Herzog family there. And the question that she was asking while we were being wrongfully ejected from this public event was, when are we going to deal with the UN human rights and that whole agenda? And you can hear her on tape asking that question as this is going down. Okay. And that really is what she was referring to. This whole question, not only of the UN and their attempts to hold Israel to account, but also this question of aid and human rights and UNRWA and all of that. Okay, so this is now coming to a head. And so then that, along then with this escalation of this attack on the U.S. base in the corner there, very likely of Syria. And by the way, it looks like any of the quote unquote response attacks via the U.S. military have not yet begun. But there's more and more indications that the Lindsey Graham types are not going to get what they want, to take it right to the head of the snake. And you hear this kind of language. Can you imagine if it were reversed, like the language of like, let's take it right to Tel Aviv, to the head of this, chop off the head of the snake, the Jewish terrorist mullahs in Tel Aviv, and all of that kind of thing.
It would be a global emergency.
Yeah, I mean
in terms of the response and everything, and it's interesting because the way narratives are set up, like any action that is taken is either going to be not enough, or it's going to be the serious hawkish escalation of things. Like, so either way, like it's kind of lose-lose in terms of like the narratives that are going to come out in response to this. It's either too weak or you're needlessly escalating things with the likely gray area of nuance in between. It was probably you're talking about like in terms of like the measured reaction as opposed to like just the go and just do just go and really just create wreak havoc and take it right to the mullahs and all this, so that then like you'll have the either way, it's kind of just, it'll be like that damned either way type of response from like the usual circles that I think we analyze and talk about here.
Right. From the sort of the pseudo-libertarian, quote unquote, anti-war MAGA wing is still sort of pushing this idea that Biden is trying to start war with Iran. And then you're right also that the Lindsey Graham wing will basically be like, this is, and the whole Israeli partisan lobby will basically be saying, shows Biden's weakness. So Biden's weakness invited October 7th, invited the Ukraine war. He's not responding to the mullahs. And meanwhile, I think there's more and more indicators that it will be it'll be sort of similar in a certain way to Iran's response to the Soleimani assassination, and that it will be highly targeted. It will be it'll show the amount of force that is potential, but my sense is that it's not going to indicate any kind of escalatory intent. And so then meanwhile, I'm still very suspicious of a combo job on these kinds of things, and the question of Israeli cyber in terms of these stand downs and intelligence failures in relationship to this question of the friend foe ID ability for this attack drone to make its way in. And I keep hearing more questioning by American military figures and analysts about that this is unexplainable. So I think that that's a question, and as I pointed out in yesterday's recording, there is this resonance with the question of it's almost the inverse of the Beirut bombings of 1982, which the more I look at it, actually were a frame job of Iranian forces, and maybe there were these Iranian forces that were involved in it, but it's sort of similar to September 11th in that way, where it was a taking a hold of a gathering attack by certain forces and then pinning it on them while escalating the entire operation to massive high-tech explosions, very likely things like tactical nuclear blasts that are the only types of things that are able to move massive amounts of soil, sort of underground, like buried tactical nuclear blasts. And Bruce Baird on X has done many threads showing the forensics of these kinds of events. And so that's my sense of even the 1982 Marine barracks attack, that was very likely an Israeli false flag that was intended to drive out the Americans, and successfully did so under Reagan. And then with the blame may be accepted by an Iranian group. Okay. So this is my sense. This is obviously a much lower level kind of operation here, and I do get the sense that it's the inverse. The desire is not to necessarily drive out the Americans this time, but to actually help escalate the Americans toward Iran and the Iranian forces, and potentially there are many forces within the Israeli government that want to really move on Hezbollah in the north. And it does look like to me that some of those forces were very likely actually probably were held back by Netanyahu at the time, because as I've been pointing out, Netanyahu's direct interest in this, both in terms of covering up his very likely command and control role in the security stand downs and intelligence failures of October 7th, and the macro geopolitical manufacturing of the situation in terms of the long-term relationship politically with Hamas and the machinations there. But also that, politically, he knows that he wants to extend this thing as much as he can for his own interests. And so I think he held off some of the Israeli military people who wanted to directly confront Hezbollah to the north. But there are beginnings to be chatters of it's time to hit Hezbollah. So this is my sense of the timing of all of this. And then, so what's very interesting is now we have the diplomatic escalation, it looks like, that was probably gathering for many weeks to maybe even many months. And going back to what I started with about this question of Biden giving the hug to the Israeli public, he then gave what was said to be a bear hug to Netanyahu, of like, all right, we obviously, you're our greatest ally, we're supporting you, but I got you tight here. And obviously that failed in terms of being able to rein in any aspect of the actual deep and long-term Israeli intent in terms of pursuing ethnic cleansing, genocidal operation in Gaza. And now it's just more out in the open, right? They had this big conference. A third of the Knesset members, I think, went to the conference of ethnically cleansing Gaza completely of Palestinians and then reoccupying it with Israelis, returning home, as they're saying, and supported by substantial portions of the Israeli public that want this to be the case. So it's obviously the case in terms of actual aspects of American diplomacy. Obviously, deeply captured, penetrated, influenced, in many ways controlled by Israeli power and the Zionist power configuration. And that still is being like, no, we're not interested in getting into some kind of massive regional war in the Middle East. And so I think at this point, there's been this rumbling inside of the State Department and aspects of the White House. We've seen some of this publicly where we had, State Department officials resign in protests. There very recently is like a fast, like a hunger strike by federal employees in terms of calling for a ceasefire. And now what we are hearing, and this is on Christiane Amanpour's show on CNN. This is her name is Alicia Kearns. She's a conservative, the chair of the UK Parliament Foreign Affairs Committee. All right. That's basically the highest level, it seems to me, like, legislator in the UK Parliament context, speaking on this. And what she's doing is explaining and backing up what the Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, wrote and said just maybe yesterday. And basically what it looks like is happening is that David Cameron has indicated that there has been a titanic shift in UK diplomacy and the way that they're going to treat this situation, where they are talking about directly recognizing Palestinian statehood. And then Amanpour brings up that this has really never been done in the West, that of course everyone gives lip service to a two-state solution and a Palestinian state and all of that, but then they point out that this has always been done under Israeli veto power. Basically, the Israelis are controlling the conversation, that the Israelis have the power to give or not give the Palestinians their state. I pointed out this is the language that even like Jared Kushner took when he went on Lex Friedman's show about how we're going to give the Palestinians some kind of smart core rumplet or maybe a statelet or something like that. And so the UK and the US, maybe what Clinton would have said, who's the goddamn superpower. And as Alicia Kearns, this head of the UK Parliament Foreign Affairs Committee, says, that for UK to take the lead, because what we're good at is hardcore diplomacy, is what she says. All right. And as we were talking about, Greg, it's obviously the case, and they even indicate this in the interview, that there's no way this kind of massive shift in the UK approach to the quote-unquote Israel-Palestine conflict or the Palestinian question would be done without the highest levels of conversations with the United States.
Yes, and this is all very interesting because, and this brings us back to where the conversation appeared to be places things potentially seemed to be going prior to October 7th. Remember, we were zeroing in on, Time Magazine publishing about how Netanyahu has made Israel America's adversary, and other things that we noticed. The types of language from people like David Rothkopf of Foreign Affairs magazine, or the Diplomat, Aaron David Miller, and people like that, of these rumblings from underneath that were becoming more and more public as far as like the shifting in Israel, why Netanyahu's taken, even I remember even back in 2019, Robert Kagan, one of the arch paleo neocons, he would be considered, in Washington Post, Netanyahu lamenting Netanyahu moving closer to global authoritarians. And so this is something that's been going on for a while. And there was this interruption. I don't know if it's an interruption quite. You even talked about like this attempt to hug the Israeli public and bear hug Netanyahu, attempt maybe to try to make some things happen through like this embrace and all of this. But in this aftermath, though, like there's still these things that are at play here, and we've been very critical, and rightly so, of like I don't, and bad doesn't even begin to describe the response or lack thereof of like the human destruction, human costs that's taken place since, and all of this. And obviously that goes into the factor of the power of organized Zionist interests that lobby through Congress, through branches of government, other areas, and that's still obviously that's still central. But even though like I want to be careful about describing, because you don't want to even attempt to even like give like the image of like even potentially even beginning to try to take away from or lessen that. But in this case, though, in terms of like diplomacy and politics, I think these things were still always on the table. And it's interesting now that that we were talking about this, as it looks like, as you said, like the hand of the Americans is in there if the British are making this move, and like that this looks like a attempt of superpower diplomacy in terms of, but the maybe as a means to take pressure or deflect criticism and heavy-handed scrutiny that would come from the usual sources here domestically. That you have the British take the public lead on this, with the U.S. Certainly influencing the process of doing this, because this we go back to still like there's still these factors at play that haven't gone away, of like what we identified even the end of the Obama administration, which looks like an effort to really even potentially pushing for going back to 1948, and a lot of the intrigue that took place at the end of the administration with the settlements, refusal to stand down the condemnation of settlements, and even Netanyahu alluding to in his book, Putin stepping in and helping deal with the certain heavy-handed Obama administration efforts towards the end, and even the talk of Biden being really as much of like a obvious friend, it seems like he's been, of like the lobby over his political career. And there's still a lot of things there that we've talked about over the years, is Iraq war sponsorship or helping that, and his constant claim of I'm a Zionist. And of course even Netanyahu, when it's advantageous to him, will push how we've been friends for 40 years, and Joe Biden's a friend of Israel's and all this. But at the same time, like there's this there has been this factor that was at play as vice president that's still at play now, and I think certainly probably even more so with the shifting, and how the political shifting that's gone on both in the West as well as in Israel, with the more of these hardliners and these real the more willing to embrace the more hardcore, more types of policies pushing for, in terms of settlements, in terms of really being heavy-handed, cracking down on the Palestinians, and so it's never gone away. And I think that now you're starting to, it looks like, and we still have to see what comes out of this, it looks like we are seeing like maybe that this is going to be the post 10/7 serious diplomatic attempt to really try to reassert and reestablish things in the midst of like all of this that never should have ever gotten to where it got to in the first place. And a big part of that is because of just how compromised, our, institutions are here in the West in terms of the global centers of power as far as being able to influence things diplomatically and otherwise. But then at the same time, there's still this element of the actual American power that does not just want to have like this state have the complete control over carte blanche to just do whatever. That's how I look at it. With that's been at play since the beginning of the establishment of the state of Israel, and I think that's been there's been this factor that's been at play all along, combined with the forces of control and influence through Congress and other institutions. And now I think that this looks like at first glance that like just starting to see like the details and discourse come out about this proposal, that this looks like this is going to be maybe this serious like diplomatic type of push for strong diplomatic push for a major breakthrough policy that I think with this move here, and it is like this assertion of, and honestly, we talk about it's not enough. Like there's so much more, obviously, but this would be a move that would be, to say it would be an important move would be an understatement. But there's does appear to be this potential push for a serious, using the diplomatic power and political power to really make something serious happen here in this moment.
Yeah, and I think that no matter what, it's obvious that this is the Nakba 2.0, the great suffering of the Palestinians, in very likely the biggest way since the original Nakba, and very likely even more so as in terms of direct mass slaughter. And it may then, in the future, depending and maybe not depending on what ultimately the outcome is, but I think this will be seen as the Palestinian Holocaust. And that, remember, that language was introduced well after World War II and the Jewish Shoah in Europe, right? And because the language of that was always about burnt sacrifice, burnt offering, these kinds of, I find, horrific moral language. But this is, of course, exactly the way that the political Zionists operated. And we will explore more of some of that earlier history of the perfidy, I would call the treason of the Zionists in terms of the way that they actually considered Jewish life, which they were said to be attempting to help revive in ancient and traditional Jewish homelands and resecure after this horrific mass slaughter and tragedy in Europe. And meanwhile, they were basically doing the opposite. They really did. The language of the Holocaust is actually totally betrays Zionist treason. That's the way I see it, is that this is the way that they saw the Jewish deaths and the Jewish suffering, was that this was a sacrifice to what I call their iron calf cult. And what Ben Gurion eventually totally gave himself over to as a cult of security, a cult of iron. I'll point out again, we're at this 100-year arc. We just passed the 100-year arc between Jabotinsky's publishing of the Iron Wall to the Operation Swords of Iron, the Palestinian Holocaust that the Israeli state is currently still perpetrating in Gaza. All right, so these are the logics. These are what Malcolm X would call the Zionist logics at work here. And so, meanwhile, the Zionists got their Iron Calf security state cult set up out of what they called the Holocaust, and what was based on partially the machinations of Zionist leaders, some of them who directly collaborated with Nazi Germany, and then others at the highest levels of Jewish power in the United States who made sure that any plan by the Roosevelt administration to help save at least hundreds of thousands of Jews from the European Shoah would be prevented, because they only cared about the facts on the ground. They only cared about how they could use Jewish lives for their Iron Calf cult operation and the ethnic cleansing in Palestine. And even the quotes from Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion was thinking this way fairly early, actually. You can go back, I think it's in the late 30s, I think, where Ben Gurion is talking about how he would rather save half of Jewish lives to Palestine than twice as many Jewish lives to elsewhere. So there you go. That is the core of the political Zionist logic, of the willingness. It begins to sound like Moloch, right? The ancient cult of Moloch, where you feed the sacrificial members of your own tribe into the mouth of the hungry god.
And anybody who tries to speak against this or try to go about some other way of things or presents themselves as being in opposition to it is then denounced as, no, you're actually the one who's the enemy of the Jewish people.
Right, which is why I continue to call myself a Jewish American patriot, because I consider myself a patriot on both of those fronts. On the, if I were African American, I would be an African American patriot, which means that you are a patriot on both of those fronts, rather than, an anti-American, a dissident, or a former Jew, or a non-Jew, or a self-hating Jew, or these kinds of things. And so there's a lot of deeper stuff here that I would like to get into in the future, which includes questions of the language of like Amalek, and how this is obviously being drawn out and utilized. This has become policy by the Israeli military on down from their prime monster, Prime Minister Netanyahu, the prime suspect of October 7th mass slaughter. And it's making its way down, and you're hearing actual videos of Israeli military soldiers talking about, we're going to, smite these Amalek. And that then goes back to the Yahweh cult in many ways, in terms of, and it's obviously genocidal language, which is why I think it's being referenced in these court cases, whether from the ICJ or to the American civil suit against Biden, Blinken, and what's his name, the Secretary of Defense, Austin.
Lloyd Austin.
Yeah, and because this is, if you actually take it on its surface, the Hasbaras are trying to whitewash the language of Amalek as basically just saying, no, this is just about, we're going to take out Hamas. No. It's not the way that it's actually operating at the level of Israeli civil society or the Israeli government or the Israeli military. And we're seeing the lines of now the Palestinian neo-refugees as they pass by face scanners, and they're being sort of ridiculed and mocked by the Israeli soldiers as they move on further down and out from their refugee homeland in other parts of Gaza. But if you go look at the actual Old Testament meaning of all this is Amalek. When you're going to war against Amalek, it's a nation. It's considered a nation. So is the use of the word Amalek actually by Netanyahu implying that the Palestinians, at least all of the Palestinians in Gaza, if not all of them in the entire region, are Amalek? Is this actually the first implied direct recognition of Palestinian nationhood by Netanyahu? It might be. So Amalek were considered a nation. They were considered a total enemy, and the proper response was to smite them all, including their women and children and their animals. So that's what we're seeing, right? Now, not all of it will be direct, and people will say, "Oh, they could have just dropped a nuke and turned it into Gaza into a glass parking lot," and all of that kind of thing. But meanwhile, we're now, seeing the situation in Gaza where when you combine the lack of water and food and medical care, you're talking about up to 1 million people at least, probably, who are in very dire existential conditions at this point. So this, I think, no matter what happens here, there will be people who, in these kinds of terms, which I don't agree with, there will be people who recognize this as the Palestinian Holocaust. So, what will come out of the Palestinian Holocaust?
Hmm.
And so this is the question on the table right now, and so I find what is going on in terms of what Alicia Kearns calls what the British are good at, hardcore diplomacy. I like that language, hardcore diplomacy. That's the kind of thing that I'm here for, right? And now it's not the kind of hardcore diplomacy I would deploy. Let's say if I were an American president,
Right.
I would deploy hardcore diplomacy in the form of things like 9/11 and 10/7 Truth and Justice, and use the stick of the 2001 authorization of use of military force against any and all 9/11 conspirators, no matter where they are. That may include then in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem as the stick to undo this entire criminal regime. And I don't mean just in Israel. I mean in a much bigger geopolitical context. All right, so that'd be the kind of hardcore diplomacy that I would pursue. That's what I've advocated since October 7th, and in relationship to how you might shift the ground in terms of the resolution of the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict to what I think will actually be seen as the only perdurable, deeper solution, which is actually from the river to the sea for all the people who have legitimate claim to those lands. All right. And so obviously that's not a call for genocide against either people. It's not a Likud Netanyahu call. If we're going to be controlling the river to the sea, this will all be our territory. Nor is it what's sort of put forth as the boogeyman of the Palestinian solidarity movement by the Hasbaras about how from the river to the sea implies a mass slaughter of all the Jews, or an expulsion of all the Jews from the area or something like that. No, it's obvious that a long-term project will be something related to we might call a binational federated or confederated security sharing state with equal rights for all. And then people who don't want to live either with Palestinians, whether they be Muslim, Christian, some of them actually probably Jewish, or quote unquote ethnic Jews, as equal, as people who have equal rights to them, then they can get out. They can go find refuge in a place where they feel like they can pursue their ethno-religious supremacist projects. All right. So they're not going to pursue that. That would be my way of doing hardcore diplomacy. But meanwhile, what is being put forth here is hardcore diplomacy
Mhm.
in its own way, right? Because what they've done, if this actually begins to go through and is not just, it could be that it's just an indicator of a diplomatic stick to threaten Netanyahu with, and the British Alicia Kearns, the British parliamentarian, she basically, indicated that could be a piece of this, but it seemed to be saying, she says, quote, "This is an enormous shift," unquote, saying any denial of statehood to both Israelis and Palestinians should be condemned. All right, and so what this is really doing is potentially a jujitsu against Netanyahu attempt to transcend in a clean break fashion the question of Palestinian rights, sovereignty, and dignity. He thought that he could transcend them by creating these Abraham Accords and this regional economic and security sharing collaboration. And we will either get to the Palestinians or we won't, but they will not be having any kind of state or anything like that. And so this is basically saying no. And Alicia Kearns basically says no country can deny another country sovereignty, including Israel trying to deny Palestine sovereignty. And so this could very much change the entire landscape of global diplomacy in terms of this. And I would point out that it will, even if I don't think it's a long-term durable situation, and in many ways I see the two-state solution as a front, as a fake to continue the long-term domination of the Israelis over the Palestinians, because of course they'll be talking about a demilitarized Palestinian state, so that's not really sovereign. But once you actually recognize the Palestinians as a nation state, then the whole situation changes on the surface. And so we'll pay attention to this as we move forward here. And as we pay attention to what's going on right now, we will also then in future episodes begin to talk about some of the deeper history that is crucial to understanding how we got here, and especially in terms of Israel and the United States. And we'll be looking into the background further of someone like Samuel Zemurray, the Banana Man, who's probably like maybe one of the crucial characters that ties together what we might call American deep politics to Israeli deep politics.
Great point. And you mentioned Jeremy, and I think you're spot on. The what you called your version of hardcore diplomacy, which is basically the politics of truth and accountability and justice, and both short term and long term. That's still going to be the real solution to. Because ultimately, if you are, you're practicing this level of diplomacy in terms of you're going to, this state's going to become a reality and you're going to have to accept it. Well, ultimately, over time, if you really are going to enforce these things and really attempt to really enforce these things in even some semblance of a fair or equitable or justifiable way, ultimately, it's going to have to be done so that the people who have ultimately, the people who have brought us to this moment, as far as brought us on the verge, both in terms of this catastrophe taking place in Palestine, also combined with the geopolitical machinations and even our own moments of domestic destabilization and unrest that are increasingly taking place as we go into the most, I think, maybe unpredictable. Certainly election year of our modern history, that you're going to have to hold these parties to account, both in terms so that we can have some real serious reckoning with and dealing with, and how we're going to get out of these, moving forward with a better way forward, but then also to ensure that these types of forces are neutralized in the future. Because if we don't have like serious truth and accountability and justice, nobody's saying it's going to be easy, but it's not supposed to be easy. But it's something that has to happen, and we're going to. I think the inevitability of facing these same problems again, or facing them even worse in the future, as we're realizing with aspects of complicity and kicking the can down the road in terms of like holding the people who attempted to stage a basically a attempted coup or overthrowing of our governmental system through the post 2020 presidential election. As that it's just going to continue. The inevitability, I think, of these things continuing to take place is more and more there. And also, if it's not dealt with, it never goes away. So, like, ultimately, you can practice this diplomatic hard power here, and obviously, it's definitely a much needed step. But ultimately, in the long term, we're going to have to. It's all of this. We're still going to have to deal with the politics of truth and accountability at a deep level, and that's something that I think we're all going to have to come to a reckoning with at some point, because it's always going to be there.
Well, that's a very important point to end on, I think, Greg. And I think you're exactly correct. And this is why we will continue to look forward and backward, down, up, and around, and with an emphasis on deep politics, which are the things that really operate beneath the surface. But in many ways, they're the things that drive crucial history. And so you're correct, like that surface level politics, open diplomacy, and a reckoning with the facts that sort of everybody has access to and knows to some extent is important. But if we don't really get beneath the surface and get into the deep politics, then we will not actually have durable solutions for the crisis of our era, which is total and massive and world spanning and goes deep within the United States. And so whether it's the institutions and the government in terms of the importance of justice for the sake of both rooting out criminality and corruption and illegitimate forces, or if it's about teaching others lessons moving forward in terms of the government and the institutions, those are both really important aspects for why we have to grapple with deep politics. And then I would say maybe especially on the side of we the people, those we're the ones, right, who are the sovereigns, out of which these institutions and governments come on down from. That for us, the importance is in actually understanding the nature of these kinds of persistence and perduring and really deepening threats when they're not actually understood and rooted out, even in terms of our minds, which is one of the reasons why we focus on questions of narrative warfare, counterintelligence, information networks, these kinds of things, because that it is we the people that are the only ones who are going to be able to preserve any society and government and a private civil society based on values that I think most all of us hold in terms of things like truth, justice, peace, freedom, equal human dignity for all. Unless we understand how the kinds of forces that put these values at threat and the logistics, the way that these operations are run, both in terms of one-off events or events that happen over time. So we will continue to keep our eye on both the clear and present and the overt things that are going on, and we will also continue to keep our focus on the covert and the subterranean and the deep elements of politics that are often either whitewashed, ignored, or purposefully obscured.
I agree, and it'll be interesting. Obviously, in the short term, like it's important that these proposals they are empowered, and that it's also going to be important to look at what the potential the pushback is this, the potential things that could be taking place that are attempted to try and undermine potential moves like this. Which, of course, there are a number of scenarios at play that we've talked about, all the way from Iran to some sort of action at the U.S. Mexico borders. But we'll be on. Those are things to be looking out for. But in the term of, like, while we do look to angle towards the long-term solution that really needs to go in the deep political, truth and accountability and justice that is ultimately needed in the short term. Like, it is imperative that these that these are able to move forward, and that there's a very vigilant eye against, like, attempts to, if this starts to move in the direction it looks like it's starting to move in, of undermining and attempting to even destroy these moves that would be ultimately certainly of benefit, both short term, and then ultimately, if you can begin to move towards, like, the long term conversations that it could really make a difference. So
Agree. So I apologize for the aspects of this conversation that were a little bit scattered, and I don't think we got a chance to fully clarify what it exactly is going on. But I think we wanted to immediately highlight and respond to what we saw happening here. So we will
yeah,
get a little bit more focus in the immediate episodes coming on
yeah,
again
for
on
sure.
that
We
matter.
kind of really just started looking at this angle over, like, the last couple hours. So
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, Greg.
thank you, Jeremy.
And thank you, everybody. We appreciate you. Until next time, Antidote, we are out.